All right, I'm gonna fade us out here and get started. Welcome everyone. We're so glad you can join us. Happy March 1st, happy start of Women's Week. I wanna start by thanking the Harvard College Women's Center for pulling this whole week together. There are so many other awesome events happening this week, of which we are just one of the first. So please go check out all of the other awesome programming that they have. And I wanna thank everyone for tuning in and joining us. For those of you at Harvard, today is a wellness day, which is the equivalent of a fifth of our spring break. And it's time that we're supposed to have off. So I really appreciate you guys choosing to spend it with us. I hope that this is an act of wellness, and I'm really excited to get started. So before we dive in, just gonna do a quick round of names and intros. Again, if you're just joining us, this is a webinar format. So only the panelists and I can be seen, but please use the chat. Please ask questions in the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on that. My name is Megan Townsend. I'm a senior at Harvard. I'm president of the Harvard Outing Club, which is co-hosting this event with the wonderful folks of the Harvard Mountaineering Club. Thank you, Alyssa and Chris and Jordan, for helping pull this event together. And I take the She series, and I will pass it over to Liz to introduce herself and then keep going around the rest of the panelists.
Cool. Hey guys, nice to meet you all. I'm Liz Roux. I graduated from Harvard College in 2019. Back in the day, I was a FOP leader and a HOC leader, and now I've been out in Southern Utah for about 2 years working as a wilderness therapy instructor. And I will pass it on to Quigs.
Hi guys, I'm Quigs. My real first name's Emily, but most people call me Quigs. My pronouns are she, hers, and I was formerly the director of the first year outdoor program, or FOP, like Liz said. I just started actually as the director of a similar program at Tufts called the Tufts Wilderness Orientation Program. And before both of those, I worked at NOLS, designing courses for a variety of different organizations and camps and schools. And I don't know what the other things were, but I'm currently in Watertown, Mass, and from South Florida. And I'll pass it to Sarah.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. So happy to be here. My name is Sarah Lockwood. I am currently in Santa Barbara, California. I graduated from Tufts University in 2013. So that's my tie to Emily. TMC was a huge part of my life, Tufts Mountain Club, although I didn't do TWO. I did not do that. I did Tufts Mountain Club. And I'm originally from Hawaii, and I currently am the CEO of College Outside, which I founded in 2015, which is a company that sells outdoor equipment to universities and provides gear discounts to college students.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Want to give some space to learn more about each of these three amazing women and how they've come to hold these roles that they just introduced us to. So I'm going to reverse it right back to you, Sarah, and ask, could you just tell us a little bit more about the role that you hold now and your relationship with the outdoors and sort of how you came to be where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, I grew up in Hawaii, and I wouldn't consider myself outdoorsy growing up. I would do like a annual family camping trip, which I usually was okay with, or an annual ski trip. But was, very athletic and did a lot of team sports in high school and middle school, and was really introduced to the outdoors my freshman year at Tufts. Through the Tufts Mountain Club, I was invited to a newcomers weekend where I went rock climbing for the first time. And that was that. I was pretty instantly hooked. So the Tufts Mountain Club was a huge part of my college experience, and was really the first time that I felt like I had really found my people, and really felt like I had a really strong community around me, and was really where I spent most of my time when I wasn't doing any sort of academic studies, up at our lodge in New Hampshire or just with the students in the club. So the outdoors is a very important part of my life. It's where I spend all of my extracurricular time. And once I graduated from Tufts, I had a job in ad sales in Boston, but I spent all of my free time ice climbing or rock climbing on the weekends. And at one point was told that there was such a thing called the outdoor industry, which I didn't even know there was an entire industry around outdoor activities, this thing that I just did for fun. And it turns out that it's an $876 billion industry, which is, fun fact, larger than pharmaceuticals and the automobile industries combined. So that means it's a really freaking big industry. So if you have any skill set that you're interested in, you can work in the outdoor industry. So I wanted to learn more about that, and I actually snuck into my first outdoor retailer trade show, which is a big trade show for the outdoor industry, and started learning about how outdoor companies supported colleges and university programs like Harvard's first year outdoor program or Outing Club, and realized that there was no real system set up there to help universities purchase equipment. So started College Outside to solve that problem, and kind of just went from there, and really do love working in the outdoor industry. So it's a real treat.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're really excited to talk more about pathways into the outdoors, both as a hobby and as an industry choice, because I think neither of those are always apparent to folks. But before we do that, we'll pivot over to Liz. You want to tell us about the role that you hold now and your relationship with the outdoors and how you got there?
For sure. So I'm currently out here as a wilderness therapy field instructor, and I feel like the more I talk about it with people, the more I realize it's sort of a niche thing. So what wilderness therapy looks like for me is that we work with adolescents, so basically teenagers who are struggling with mental health, with substance use disorder, and other family conflicts. And these kids come out into the wilderness and they live out in the desert for 2+ months at a time. My job is that I'll rotate in every 8 days and then come back out to the field for 6 days and then go back into the field for 8 days. And I'll work with them to, do everything from first aid to make sure that they don't get impaled with a cactus. And I'll also do a lot of sort of like therapeutic processing and clinical therapy with them in partnership with their actual clinical therapists who will come out into the desert to work with them and their families. And so what got me into this is that, tracing backwards a little bit, I definitely really enjoyed and I found a lot of identity in the outdoors community in college. And I think we'll touch on this later, but I found a lot of empowerment to it as well, not only being able to feel comfortable in the outdoors, but also just feel confident in my own abilities as a human. And so my end goal and what I'm going to be transitioning into in the next couple of years is to go to medical school. And so graduating from college, I thought it was a really precious thing to be a care provider, such as a medical professional, but showing care and providing care can look a lot of ways. And I feel like for many of us, nature has been sort of a solace and a healing aspect in our lives, and also a fun thing to do. So I was interested to see how nature could be sort of a care provider and how I could work with that with kids out here. And so that's what brought me here. And I think as far as roots of it go, I feel like many people are attracted to nature for many reasons. For myself, I wouldn't have always called myself an outdoorsy person growing up, but I definitely did love nature, and that love was able to evolve into becoming more of an outdoors woman once I learned some more of the skills.
That's terrific. I'm so glad you found another path into it in college. Quigs, over to you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to pull all the pieces together. I had kind of a tough home family situation growing up, and I went to summer camp every summer. It was an all-girls camp, and it felt like the only place where I could really be myself. I could try new things. It was very much an empowering space, full of people who I didn't feel like were judging me, but also it was very emotionally vulnerable. It was very okay to cry, and it all was taking place in kind of this space that was a little bit removed. And I didn't feel like I had that again until I got to college and started doing outdoor programs there, specifically the outdoor orientation program that I did when I was a freshman. And it was kind of that feeling again of oh, I can be kind of this weird, wacky self. I can be queer, I can be Jewish, I can be me. I can kind of just dig into all of these different parts of myself and be supported in that. But I also simultaneously was studying computer science, and there was always kind of this weird tension because I was oh, this one thing is very mechanical and feels kind of like I have to work in that field and feels very like industry centric. And then this other thing where I feel like I'm really free to be myself, and the people that I'm with are free to be themselves. And there's like this really great community. And that always felt kind of weird to me. And then after I graduated, I worked for a little bit in tech, and I just kind of saw a lot of like toxic work culture that I was really overwhelmed by. And it was weird because then once I finally left, I gave it 2 big tries, and I said, let me try 2 different companies. And eventually was like, if I'm gonna be up all night working my ass off, I'd rather it be for a program that I care about and love. And so I went back to working at Tufts, running the outdoor orientation program, and then later at Harvard. And I think with like slowly I ended at NOLS, and I think through all of those experiences saw a lot of parallels of like masculinity, like competition, individualism, all these things that felt really toxic in tech. But it felt more like a space where I could have an impact, because I felt like there was still space to create like healing zones and like little communities of people who were like radically trying to be honest with each other and live together and rely on each other. And so I kind of felt like I wanted to continue moving in a direction where I could create those places and do that, even though like the industry as a whole feels really overwhelming sometimes, and maybe and not the most welcome to a lot of different types of people. I felt like maybe I could try to find a little places to maybe like peel that apart a little bit. So that's kind of generally, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Quigs, I really appreciate you talking about communities in the outdoors. The theme of this Women's Week is holding community, and then also self, right? We bring, many people think that they have an outdoor self, and we also bring many different versions of ourself. You name some of your identities with us into the outdoors. So I wonder if we might explore a bit what it means to be a woman in the outdoors specifically. I know that's the whole subject of this panel, but let's start by thinking about, what are some outdoors experiences that you've had where you were aware of your gender as a woman in either a positive way or a negative way? And please feel free to bring in any other identities you might hold. I'll leave this one open, so if anyone is compelled to answer, go for it.
I can keep talking. I think one of the things that really kind of started me on this journey of thinking about gender in the outdoors was actually I was talking to someone when I was in college, and we were talking about how the way that Tufts used to do it, they don't do it this way anymore, but most co-pairings were like boy-girl co-leaders, and the male co was always the fun co, and the female co was always like the one that would like keep them in check. And I had never like thought about it like that, but when somebody said it, I remember being like, I am fun and I don't get to be fun. And I was like so upset and just like felt like this part of me that I had been not acknowledging. I hadn't even realized it myself until somebody else had said it. And I became really frustrated. And I think that like sparked a lot of the like later thoughts I had of like, okay, also how are like women being gendered, but also how are we trying to be like super women in the outdoors? How are we trying to appear strong enough or appear like, like some of my favorite female instructors or outdoor educators like make it a point to wear like makeup and jewelry and skirts in the outdoors, because like I think that there's a lot of rhetoric that we can't really do that. And I think that all sparked when I realized I was not the fun co. And then also I went to an LGBTQ outdoor summit, which if anybody has an opportunity to go, it's a really beautiful place. And we talked a lot about how like nature itself does not care if we're gay or whatever, or trans or women, but like the people do. And so how does that like nature does care, but it doesn't. So how do we kind of grapple with both of those things being true at the same time? And those are some, it was a really cool community to be a part of for that moment of like all these people who have had similar experiences, but don't often get to interact with each other.
I want to jump in after Quigs because I think it's a really powerful point that nature doesn't care about our gender identity or our sexual orientation. And I can speak to that mostly from the wilderness therapy perspective, where a lot of the adolescents that we work with are struggling with either gender identity, sexual orientation, or both. And they're not only struggling with it with themselves of how to come out or how to own themselves with the people that they care about, but also how to sort of balance that when they're in an intensely and physically uncomfortable situation of living outside for 2 months. And so the ways that I've seen that manifest through my job and how I've tried to support the adolescents I work with through that is that typically our therapy groups are separated by gender identity. And so we'll have those who identify as women and those who identify as men or young men and women in each. And we'll also have transgender students who can then go to the group with which they identify. And within that, you know, the groups that identify mostly as young men, we do see patterns of a lot of like aggression, anger, defiant behavior, right? Oppositional defiance. And part of what really comes out for them is that they feel like they have to respond like this because they're not really aware of another way to be like manly per se. And it's my role in terms of I'm often the only female staff member in an all male identifying group with all other male staff. And so I'm not only trying to sort of represent my gender in the outdoors, but I'm also trying to represent women in general to them. And the interesting juxtaposition with a lot of these adolescent men are that they feel less pressured to conform to those male stereotypes when they can see that women don't have to conform to female stereotypes. So one example of that I've seen is that if I can, I often serve as a representation to reframe their ideas of different roles women can play in their lives, of different things that women can offer to the world, and also of different ways that they can be themselves that don't also have to be defined by gender. And then on the flip side, when I work with largely like female identifying or women identifying groups, we can talk a lot about empowerment in terms of they understand that the outdoors is typically like a gendered place and typically also a socioeconomically skewed place to be. And so we've engaged with that in terms of feeling empowerment where they can feel empowerment. And a lot of that comes from our own bodies and understanding how that works in nature. So for example, I have a lot of empathy for all these young women who are starting to get their periods and menstruating for the first time in the outdoors and trying to understand it more from, and this is like the hopeful doctor in me, but understanding it more from like a biological standpoint of like, well, this is what menstruation is, this is how it works, this is how we can deal with it in the outdoors. And once they can sort of understand the knowledge base of that, then they can become empowered. It's actually like an empowering thing to take charge of one's body and one's gender rather than the opposite of feeling overwhelmed. I will likely ramble if I continue, but those are some thoughts that came to mind. And Quigs, thanks again for the quote. That was pretty great.
That's terrific. And Liz, we have a question for you in the Q&A. How are other genderqueer or non-binary participants included in the groups at your program?
So if a student comes, so we call them students or clients, but if a student comes into the program already identifying with a certain gender, they will be placed in that gendered group. And so within our groups, we have men identifying groups and women identifying groups. And then within those groups, we'll have women who are struggling with anxiety and depression, women who are struggling with eating disorders, et cetera. And so then they'll be further split into that. As far as sexual orientation, we don't identify by sexual orientation. And the intention behind that is not that it's not important. The intention behind that is that we want to come to terms with who we are before we come to terms with who we want to be with. And so we have open conversations with that, but I think that is our focus is the gender identity first with that. We've also had some clients or students who have come in and been struggling with their gender identity. And then once we can work through that with them, if they're able to come to something that they feel that they identify with, we can then move them to a different group with which they identify.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Just really, really cool shares from both of you. Thank you. The way that I've always thought about how my gender and my experiences in the outdoors relate is this idea, as you've both said, that kind of the outdoors doesn't really care what gender you are. It's just the outdoors. And for me, it's always been a pretty incredible mirror for me to learn more about myself and what are the stories and stereotypes that I absorbed as my own personal identity, like whether or not I knew that I was absorbing them. And I can explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But I think like to start, when I started getting into outdoors and outdoor groups in college, I was really lucky through the Tufts Mountain Club to have a number of women who were a grade or two older than me, who were amazing examples, who were very strong rock climbers or very independent and kind of doing their own thing. And so I think one thing that was really crucial for me right out of the gate was I had examples of women who were equally capable as men in the groups that I was a part of, which was really helpful. But for me, as I reflected on this, I realized that in a lot of outdoor activities, I often defaulted to kind of playing the either non-responsible role, or I would default to making excuses for myself and to why I couldn't do something. Oftentimes that was, I'm not strong enough or big enough, or my muscles aren't strong enough, for example. And would kind of default to others taking charge of a situation. And I had this kind of very confronting experience the first time where I went hiking with one of my very close friends who was a guy. We were trying to do a traverse of the Franconia Ridge in the winter. And he had expected both of us to do equal preparation for the trip, which would be a reasonable thing for you and an adventure partner to do equal preparation and to pack your own equipment. But I kind of defaulted to him and didn't do enough preparation for my own apparel and equipment, and didn't do my own research and really take responsibility, frankly, for myself on that trip, and ended up getting my first case of really bad frostbite and managed to make it down off of a side trail. We didn't finish the trip because my feet were totally frozen. And it was really an interesting experience, because at first I really wanted to like almost blame him and be like, why didn't you tell me what I needed? Or why didn't you tell me what was the important gear to have? And what I realized is also I didn't ask those questions, and I didn't take responsibility for my own well-being on that trip. So the outdoors has really like challenged me to step into my own power as an individual, and to realize that I am capable of doing and learning and preparing. And oftentimes in the outdoors, I think, especially with outdoor activities, especially ones that are risky, there's almost a little bit more on the line for when you have to take responsibility for yourself, and realize the stories that might be holding you back. But in general, I think like, yeah, the outdoors can be an incredible place to look at ourselves kind of in a neutral state, and look at the stories that we're telling ourselves that might be holding us back. And also build relationships with others who are doing the same thing, and build an opportunity to build really deep and vulnerable relationships with our friends and partners around what we need and how we're doing in any given activity, I think.
Yeah, and if I could, I'd love to run with this thread of the stories that we tell ourselves as women in the outdoors and how we come to hold those stories. I know even on this panel and among our guests, I'm sure people have different levels of time and different experiences that they've had in the outdoors. And so I'd love to hear from some or all of you, just zooming back a bit, how can we think about the outdoors in terms of what are the obstacles that exist for women in this space, and what about the outdoors do we need to understand as you've experienced it before we can sort of move towards that more inclusive reality?
I'd like to take a crack at this one to start, just from a historical perspective of the outdoor industry, as I've kind of read about it and seen it, which is just like historically, like a lot of things, major ascents and the outdoor industry was built by men, specifically white men in the US and in Europe. And so what that means is that as this industry was being built and as all of the media and companies were being built around it, most sponsorship, marketing dollars, and media went to telling the stories of other white men in the sport and industry. Now, a lot of that was because of just the role that like women did not have that level of financial independence, for example, to be able to afford their own gear, take time off, go and train for these trips. That was not something that women were even capable of doing in the last, or prior to 30 or 40 years ago, right? So it's really important to understand like how relatively recent it is for a woman to be able to have full financial independence for herself, which then allows her to go and, you know, go on a rock climbing trip or what have you. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to consider, and is not something that I really understood until I started working in the outdoor industry. So like I said, kind of when I was in Tufts in the mountain club, it was a pretty even split of men and women, and our climbing team was pretty evenly split men and women. But when I started working in the outdoor industry, 90% of my meetings with outdoor brands would be with men. And that was when and this is maybe, you know, 8 or 9 years ago when I started doing this, 9 out of 10 meetings would be with men. And that's when I was realizing like, okay, there's still a pretty strong emphasis or skew towards the men who are running things in this industry. So I do think there has been a pretty significant shift and effort made towards making sure that sponsorship dollars are more allocated to not just your white dudes, but also to others. To telling the stories of all incredible athletes is really important, and there is a shift. But when momentum's kind of like in one going in one direction, there needs to be an effort to kind of change that direction, if that makes sense. That's kind of a historical framework that I felt like was important to lay out.
I can go next. I think kind of also historically and still currently, just in general, our concept of recreating outside is rooted in exclusion and racism. I think a lot about Yellowstone, which is our first national park and heralded as this great conservation thing, but it was created by starving group, like 4 different tribes who primarily got food by hunting in the Yellowstone area. And as soon as it became a national park, it effectively was another policy of Indian removal. And so I think kind of building off of that, the outdoors has been a traumatic place for a lot of different people. It's where a lot of hate crimes take place, a lot of like people are left. And then you kind of move forward and still have like the outdoors as a lot of parents who either have experienced homelessness or are undocumented and have kind of gone through hardships in the outdoors, kind of then don't understand why their kids would want to recreate outdoors, or kids who are saying, why would I do this if my parents kind of have gone through these other things? And so I think when I think about like what is like who is able to recreate outdoors, I think there's really kind of a bigger question of how are we reframing the outdoors and creating it as a place of healing instead of just perpetuating what it was originally as kind of a space that was designed to keep people out, and kind of built like on top of that, it also is that nature is like, I think we commonly think of nature as separate from ourselves as opposed to like us being a part of nature. And that's like furthering this idea of white supremacy and like distancing ourselves from Indigenous teachings and Indigenous wisdom, which like are all about people being in balance with the environment because we are part of the environment. And so I think like, then I guess when we're kind of transitioning to specifically talk about gender, I think the big part of it for me is like, okay, what does that balance look like? And like, I think when we're talking about who's climbing the fastest or getting to the most peaks or having the best gear, that all kind of is built off of this like white supremacist, patriarchy, capitalist kind of nation that we have. Because at the end of the day, like, what are we using this space for? If it's just to kind of like prove ourselves, then that's not really doing anything. We should use it intentionally because if it's there, we should use it, I don't know, to build community and build love and find joy. I don't know why it would be used for anything else except for, I don't know, pride.
Yeah, the story around just always having to be better and try harder and go bigger is one very narrow view of what it means to recreate in the outdoors and like what it can bring you, right?
Yeah, and I think at a point that becomes antithetical to fulfillment, right? It's not sustainable. You can always do more rather than having a steadier relationship with the outdoors, which is reciprocal and inclusive of everyone. I was reminded of something that you said, Tara, when we were planning for this event, actually, which is that there's no inclusivity except inclusivity of everyone, except total inclusivity. And I do think that that's sort of what you're describing, Quigs. That was a really wonderful point. So thank you for that. That's a tough act to follow, Liz, but would love to know anything you'd like to add to this chapter of our conversation.
Yeah, rather than trying to reiterate all the points just said, I was going to come at it with a different angle, which I think, and I think this has been touched on, but I think mentorship is definitely key. And the struggle with that is that we're starting to get more women in the outdoors, right? And therefore there will be more women mentors for future women to get into the outdoors, etc. But it is sort of like a gradual exponential increase as far as that goes. And I think what my mind goes to with mentorship is that, you know, my current job, I chose specifically, and one of the reasons I chose it was because it's run by pretty much all women. So our program director is a woman, our field director is a woman, our assistant field director is a woman, and we have over 60% of our field staff, including myself, are women. And so both within at Harvard College with HOC and FOP, and then back here in wilderness therapy, I have experienced a lot of women representation in the outdoors. And so and I think that's a privileged place to be. It shouldn't be, but it is. And I think the idea with that is that what it sort of reciprocates in my head is that, well, we just need more women leadership, and that will trickle up in order to create more space and accommodation for women. But on the other side, another point that I want to touch on more that you guys both hinted at is socioeconomics. And that's something that I can speak to probably most just out of personal experience, where the big transition for me between going from just liking nature and liking animals and the environment to then feeling like I was an outdoors woman was I got an opportunity in high school to go on an outdoors trip through a local scholarship. I had never even heard really of backpacking before that. It was a backpacking trip in Alaska, and I really had no idea what it meant to outdoor recreate. I just knew that I liked going to the beach because I also grew up in Florida, Quigs.
What?
I know, right?
We have to talk about that later.
It's a wonderful place. So then, like, you know, that was my first time in mountains, first time carrying a backpack and doing this whole outdoorsy recreation thing. I then pretty quickly jumped up to being an incoming first year in college. And I never would have done FOP if they didn't have full financial aid for people who already qualified for aid at the college. And the same thing with joining the outing club, where they had aid for people to do trips for free. I felt like that really increased the representation too, and just eliminating barriers, I think, for everyone. That whole, like, it has to be inclusive for everyone from all areas that Sarah was saying, and not just under this one category. I've seen that a little bit in wilderness therapy as well, where unfortunately wilderness therapy is pretty niche still, and so insurance doesn't cover it, and and it's expensive to keep someone alive in the wilderness for 2 months, plus give me enough to pay my own bills. And so we tend to see a lot of our clients and a lot of our students are from a more wealthy background. At that same time, my company is the only company in the industry that does a scholarship program to bring in students of color who are struggling. And that's still a minority of the groups, right? We probably have about 20% of our clients come from that scholarship. And yet I still think it's better than nothing. I think it's trying to move things in the right direction, because just as we all have a right to get to experience the outdoors, I think that we all should have a right to experience healing through the outdoors too. But yeah, that's what comes to mind, Megan.
The idea of, like, what are the barriers that prevent somebody from being able to have a positive and healing experience in the outdoors, I think is certainly one that's worth thinking about and addressing. That just cost of access is one of them. The reality is it's not safe or fun to go backpacking or climbing or skiing with the wrong equipment, right? And the reality is that outdoor equipment is very expensive. It's something that obviously we think a lot about at College Outside, and it's one of the reasons that I love working with university programs who invest a lot of resources in having equipment to rent, because that's enough, or borrow for free if you're a student. And one thing I've noticed on a lot of college campuses is it's not like a well-known resource that, even though there's outdoor equipment that universities have, it's only really maybe promoted to a very narrow group of students as an amazing resource to go outside for the first time, for example. So I think that that's a really cool program, and we're starting to see gear libraries pop up in communities as well, not just on university campuses, but within like community centers, so that like the wider area can borrow, even a 10-hour sleeping bag and go and actually be warm and sleep outside and enjoy that, which is really interesting. And then in terms of kind of like barriers, there's already so many barriers in terms of getting outside and having a good time, financial or otherwise, and actually enjoying a sport and being able to challenge yourself, and all of the amazing growth opportunities that brings you. And when that's already hard enough, and then you add all of kind of the layers of gendered stories on top of that, that is just like one more thing that you have to work through to actually be able to enjoy yourself, or to be able to find fulfillment in something that you're doing in the outdoors.
I just also want to highlight that this is kind of rooted in the fact that I got a dog recently and I go to the dog park every day and I love the dog park. But I do think that there's something to be said for like, a cost is absolutely a barrier, and so is a lot of large outdoor recreating being in rural places that are really scary for a lot of people, and getting to those places is really hard. But there's so many opportunities to be outside that don't require all of that, and I think like a foundational place to start doing outdoors things is going on walks, is finding local parks, is finding a space that we're excited about, where we don't need fancy gear to get there. And I was just reading an article on Melanin Base Camp about like talking to parents and getting families outside, and that a lot of that, when there is any sort of like cultural or just like any sort of inhibition, that kind of the first step is just saying, we can wear our sneakers, you can wear this clothing that's more comfortable for you. And when I was at NOLS, like a big part of what we did for some of our courses was like, if there was a shirt that people needed to get, instead of kind of sending the Patagonia one that like would be the best, we would like have a picture of like, or say like, you can just bring a workout shirt, any shirt that you would wear to play basketball, or any shirt that you would wear to just like run around outside, would be fine. And like, kind of just not necessarily always sticking to like, you must have this, like, obviously it's not fun to have bad gear, but I also think there's a big middle ground between like the best gear and bad gear. And then there's also a middle ground between like Yosemite and I don't know, my backyard. And I just feel like finding all the spaces in between is part of the joy of finding the outdoors, to me at least. And I think it shouldn't be understated, because especially in the pandemic, I've found so much solace and peace in finding local outdoor spaces that are equally as valuable.
On the jumping in, because we're all like gear junkies in here, I also want to think about not only, so having the right gear is important to keep you safe and to feel like you can do it. Having gear that will do the job and doesn't have to be the super fancy brand, will still do the job, is great too for barriers. And something I've also found, and this especially pertains to getting people of color into the outdoors. We've had a lot of students of color at my company who have felt pretty uncomfortable physically in the outdoors, not only because they're not as used to it or exposed to it, for the variety of reasons that we just said, but also because they have different like physical like needs. And what I mean by that is that, for example, we have a lot of African American students who have to take care of their hair, and being out in the desert for 2 months without like having the right products to like care for your body and do self-care like will not make you feel very good. And so trying to think of gear as well as like comfort and sanitation to an extent, so that they can feel like they can own themselves, for like, I don't know, even just giving them like shea butter and like a comb or a pick for their hair, I feel like makes them feel like they can belong out there, and that they can own who they are and engage with the outdoors as they are, rather than having to conform to all of like the fancy Instagrammable gear things that we see on social media all the time too. But yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if we can, it's hard And it makes sense that as we talk about barriers, we also talk about solutions, but I know this is a very solution-oriented chat, and it's been great to hear some of the things that are working in your spaces to combat and overcome these barriers. I wonder if we could transition to that for our next 5 minutes, knowing that we want to get to open questions by 8:50. So folks who are listening in, please think about questions and start to populate the Q&A. But yeah, I wonder if you could share what's been working in your spaces and where you think we can go from here, and feel free to tie in the outdoor industry piece of it.
Liz, you mentioned leadership in your program, and I'm curious to hear more about that and like the importance of that you've seen and how other organizations might be able to do that.
Sarah, are you like talking about personal leadership or leadership in terms of the program structure?
Both, but I was thinking program structure.
Right. So I think as far as program structure goes, the company itself was like founded by, I believe, mostly men. And yet the people who have kept it running for the past 20 years through all the craziness that happens in wilderness therapy have been primarily women. As far as I'm aware, they came into it through the same job that I've been doing, and they sort of worked themselves up the ranks with that. And I think part of that is that it seems to be that women are more likely to stay in the job or in the industry longer than men. I'm not sure why that is. From the personal perspective in terms of leadership, within the field staff structure that we have out there, we have like sort of a hierarchy of experience level. So if I've been around for about 3 months, I'm not as experienced as someone who's been around for 6 months, and therefore they're going to have the higher lead. I've worked most recently as the leader of my staff group, which means that I'm, I'm like the boss of the other staff who are out there in the field with me, as well as trying to sort of supervise and oversee everything for the kids. And what I've seen with leadership in regards to gender has been, I find more often than not that female staff are more likely to ask questions and advocate for their needs. And they're also less likely to question my authority in an impolite manner. And I don't want to make generalizations by gender, but I have seen that as a trend. And I wonder if that contributes sometimes to like toxic work culture in general in the world, but also definitely in the outdoors industry where, I don't know, maybe it's just society sees it as that men are supposed to be sort of the alpha, both in company leadership and also in like just leading outdoors trips. And I've also wondered for myself that I'm one of the younger field staff who work out there. So, I'm 23 years old, and some of them, the men who work under me on my field team have been anywhere between 21 years old and 45 years old. And so I wonder if that also plays a role with like, you see a young woman in a leadership position, you sort of doubt her grit, I think, for lack of a better word.
Emily, from a programmatic perspective, while we're on like programmatic structure, I feel like I want to hear from you on this too. Oh, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I needed to take a sip of water. Yeah, I definitely thought about this question both personally and programmatically. Programmatically, I think I was really inspired by, so when I was at NOLS, we pushed for affinity courses for LGBTQ people and leaders of color. They had been running women's trips for a while that had like varied in popularity. But there's this one quote by someone who's on the Leaders of Color expedition named Marianne Thomas, who's really cool. She like biked around the world or something. And but one of the things that she said, the reason the course was amazing is because they got to embark on the glorious act of world building, and they got to kind of find joy outside of what was expected of them. And so I think obviously affinity spaces is kind of a buzzword right now, but I think creating both trips that are in the backcountry as well as spaces for leaders, so like college trip leaders, but anyone who's part of the community, to kind of like have that safe space that's really empowering to then be able to kind of like be a part of the community more broadly, but have that like really foundational base of joy, of self, of identity, is something that's really important. And then the other thing that is I left NOLS and came back to higher education is I think it's really cool that both FOP and TU and HMC and TMC are student led. And I think like that's a really cool opportunity because a lot of times like older adults, not to be ageist, but are like very much set in their ways. And especially when it's like a corporation or a company. Whereas I think what's really cool about all of you guys, like young people are more able to adapt and think about things in new ways. And so just like having these conversations, role modeling what it means to be inclusive. So like when I go on trips, I try to really intentionally ask for help, even if I don't need it, like saying that I'm not good at something or being vulnerable in some way that shows like we are all collectively here doing this is something that like young people can do as leaders, I think a lot more naturally. And so that like means that the culture can change a lot faster, at least in my mind. And that's something that's really exciting to me. And also just both personally and organizationally is being intentional about researching and talking about the history of the space that we're recreating in, because that both like honors the people that were there before, but it also ties us all together. Like it ties us to the future, it ties us to the past. It's like a respect for the space, and it like causes, when we do land acknowledgements, when we talk about land history, what it ultimately is a reflection. And I think the more reflection that we can do as an organization or as people who recreate outside, the better, because it kind of like reflection lends itself to all the things we've been talking about, which is like healing and working together and overcoming these stories that we tell ourselves. And that all starts with reflecting. So I think the more space that we can find for reflection, the better. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say, Sarah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that the programs, especially these college programs, are super amazing. I mean, even when I was at Tufts, if we had a women's panel about outdoor options and examples of that, like that would have blown my freaking mind, right? Like that was not something that we even like had 10 years ago or even realized was important. But for me, it certainly has been important to surround on Liz's point of mentorship, like both professionally and in my personal spaces, like having women kind of be there right next to me, understanding the struggles that I'm experiencing that are unique to my own identity has been incredibly powerful. I want to add a little bit of a lens programmatically. I think you both are super on point. And I will say from an athletic standpoint, I'll bring in a little bit of personal history here, but I pursue a lot of sports that are pretty dominantly still male sports. So the three main sports I participate in right now are paragliding, surfing, and mountain biking. Especially in paragliding is where I'm really trying to push it as a personal athlete. And 90% of the sport is men, especially at a competitive level. So that means like here in Santa Barbara, when I go to just do the fun thing that I want to do on the weekend, I'm typically the only woman in a group of 20 to 30 men. You know, I really love this sport. It's something that I care a lot about, but I also, when I'm doing an activity, I'm doing it not just because I want to fly or climb or bike. It's because I also want to be part of a community and I want to like build good relationships with other people and like feel like they understand me and we can learn from each other. And it's certainly been a battle for me to stick, especially through the first year, to stick in the sports that I wanted to be in, that I like was really drawn to, and yet did not necessarily feel welcome or just feel like it was a space for me. And so I've spent a lot of time here in Santa Barbara thinking about that. Certainly in particular activities, it's not that they're meant for certain types of people. It's how do we make it seem like they're for everybody? And there's a little bit of that storytelling too, right? Like, for example, a lot of people don't get into mountain biking, for example, because they're like, to be a mountain biker means that on day one, I need to like send the NAR and jump off a 10-foot cliff. You know, like that's what it means to be a mountain biker, which like really what it can mean is just like take any bike that you can grab or borrow and like go bike on a dirt road. And like, that is mountain biking too. And it doesn't always have to be this like really intense thing. And so like making sure that like, when we're talking about sports or when we're including others, like you said, it's not just about it being a really intense thing. It can just be an opportunity to get outside and experience all of the healing benefits from that. So as we talk, as I try to create spaces where women are welcome. It's also, I've found it important to create gatherings of women in outdoor activities. I've experienced this both in paragliding as well as in mountain biking, where there's something about groups of women coming together and being able to support each other and kind of like egg each other on. And I know that, like me personally, I've experienced that all of my kind of excuses fall away when I go climbing, for example, with a group of 4 women, right? If they're all climbing a lot harder than me and they're like, Sarah, get on the rope, I don't really have any excuses. I'm going to go try it. And I might not have tried that before. And especially if I was with a group of guys, that might not have been something I've tried before. So being intentional about creating welcoming spaces where there's like-minded also individuals as well, I think is also very important.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot to the chat now and know that we might just go a few minutes over if that's okay with you folks. I know we started a few minutes late. I want to get to at least some of these questions. And I think, Sarah, I'm going to direct one right back at you. This is from Jenna. Thank you, Jenna. How do we approach and mitigate the pervasiveness of white feminism in efforts to make the outdoors more inclusive? I recognize that, 3 of us on this call are white women. And so how do we, in making inclusion for everyone, how do we have it not just be inclusion for white cis women, but for all women and for all people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I answer that, I definitely want to say that this is an area that I'm certainly learning about myself. And I'm more than certain that I have already made mistakes in this call, and I've already learned so much from everyone on this panel. So thank you for your compassion on that as I kind of fumble through some of these concepts for myself as well. Certainly, I'm also a white cis woman, and so that's my experience. So as I think about inclusive spaces, I think about how difficult it is to, exclusivity means saying that a certain space or activity is only for one specific type of person. I think about as you dismantle a certain stereotype, it often dismantles it for many, many groups of people. So as we say, this is not just a sports or a space for a one type of person, that often makes it available to others. So in my work, especially at College Outside, one thing that we think about for our company's perspective is we take it very seriously, especially like our marketing and media efforts, to make sure that we are telling the stories of lots of different types of people in the outdoors, knowing that it's not just one type of person who can and should participate, and making sure that all different types of people are represented. But it definitely, knowing the bias that I do bring to the table, it's something that I think I try to be aware of in my personal work and my work, knowing that if I didn't think about it, I would just kind of go and continue easily without thinking to tell the stories of just other white women or other white people in the outdoors. So I don't have a solution there, but it is definitely just something that I do think about. And then in terms of the idea of a space being inclusive, is about not just, it should be inclusive for everybody.
Liz or Quigs, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just want to bring up the bird watching situation that happened this summer. I think was very representative of how white women have used the outdoors to continue policing Black and brown bodies. And I think that story affected me because, I think about this all the time and how it plays out in the outdoors. And it was in a park that's used by a lot of people. And it was just like so blatantly, like, when I think about the outdoors, like we're actually talking about like the physical placement of people and how we're valuing different places. And I felt like the more that we can talk about what it means to police each other's bodies, the better. And like that situation, I think, reminded me of that. And so what I try to do is just like, anytime I'm going to question what somebody else is doing in the outdoors, I like try to just like take a second and say, like, is this me just trying to police their experience because it's not what I'm familiar with? And then like kind of passing that along to others, like friends and students and people that I work with. And then I also try to think about when I'm running trainings for students that are around, well, I think it's really important to infuse like issues of identity into every single training because it's relevant to everything. It's like part of risk management, it's part of everything. And when we do that, who is the audience of those trainings? Is the audience always going to be white people? Then how, like, that's alienating people of color that are on staff. And so I think they're, like, when we think about these things holistically, I think ultimately it comes down to like where our bodies are located and how they're being policed and how they're being placed. And I think those issues are all tied together. But yeah, I don't know if I really answered the question, but it just reminded me to mention that.
I think the only thing I can add here is that I feel like I'm in a bit of like an in-between situation where on the one hand, I'm the only, or at least while I was, the majority of the time while I've been working wilderness therapy, I was the only non-white person at the company, not just among the field staff, but with it throughout the entire leadership and office staff of the company. And at the same time, like I recognize that being adopted, like I grew up in basically like a white culture and with a white family. And so have therefore had privileges that other people of color have not, and other women of color have not. But yeah, especially within my job, just because I am the only person of color there, I do recognize that, yeah, like there's something's going on here that it's typically white women who are here. There are a lot of women here, but they're all white. And that also goes for the men. And just bringing awareness to that, just because that's what I've seen in my experience.
Mm-hmm. I want to pivot to one more question. All of those were really powerful, but just on this solutions bent, how have you seen gatekeeping manifest itself in your outdoors spaces, and how do we call it out, and how do we move forward? And for anyone who's listening who's not familiar, gatekeeping usually refers to someone withholding knowledge from another group or access.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question. The only thing that pops into my head immediately is that in the broader sense, in the more casual sense, I found that there is, I've been preaching all this about mentorship and how important that is, especially among friends you may have that are involved in the outdoors. And yet, even I am guilty of this, where if I have a friend who is not as familiar with a certain activity or a certain terrain as I am, it's a higher barrier for me to be able to introduce them to that rather than to something they're already sort of know how to do, right? And perhaps that's laziness on my part, or perhaps that's me like seeing this barrier and not having enough volition to go over it with someone. And then examples that pop into my mind are like, well, rock climbing, for example. There's a lot of different things to do out here in the desert. Rock climbing is one of them. But if I have a friend who's never rock climbed before, one, out of safety, and two, out of just the fatigue of teaching someone, sometimes I'll just go on a hike with them instead of going rock climbing. And I'm not sure what that speaks of for me personally, or what that speaks to in the larger issue of gatekeeping. But sometimes I feel like the barriers to the outdoors can even be barriers for people who want to do things with their friends too.
Yeah, what you're saying. Oh, Sarah, did you want to go? I kind of was reminded of, I don't know if this happens in a lot of places, but when I lived for a while in Wyoming, and there was a lot of like rhetoric that was like, don't tell anybody about Wyoming. It was very like, Wyoming's closed, like we hate it here, don't come, to try to like keep it wild. And I feel like, I guess what Liz was saying just reminded me of that, because I feel like there's kind of this mentality of like, we're going to keep these secret spots. And if you're not good enough, then you're not going to come with me to this one spot, or I don't have time to like teach this, so I'm going to bring you to this easy thing. And I think that I mean, I definitely have both been complicit and have called it out. And I think there's no way to be perfect in that, because I definitely have felt the feeling of like, I don't want this place that's really special to me to be ruined. But like ruined by who, and that like deserves interrogating. And I think like when I've had friends say Wyoming's closed or it's terrible here, like I definitely try to question them on that, because ultimately like they also were transplants to Wyoming. They're not locals. They're not people who grew up there. And so just like recognizing where are we doing that, like when is conservation or keeping something wild actually just a way to keep people out, and like continuing to question that, I think, is important.
Thank you all. That was really great. And I know we're over time, so I'm gonna close things out here. But as we do, just wanna understand all of this as an ongoing conversation. I hope that we will have these conversations in all of our own spaces, whatever that might be. I'm gonna invite our panelists to put their emails in the chat if folks would like to reach out to them and get in touch and ask them any questions that we weren't able to get to. I wanna make a plug for the real life action part of this Zoom webinar, which is that HOC and HMC are doing a matching drive to support 2 different orgs, Brown Girls Climb and Queer Nature, which are both really terrific orgs. You can learn more about them in the email. If you Venmo at HOC-general, any amount, we will match it up to $400. So that can become $800 supporting women in the outdoors, queer people in the outdoors, outside of this virtual call. And anyone who does that will be entered to win a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass, which is an amazing book, indigenous knowledge fused with plant science, incredible read by an amazing woman. So it's win, 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 win. So please do that. I'll throw that Venmo in the chat. But really, thank you all so much for coming. It's been a privilege to be part of Women's Week. I hope that you will show our incredible panelists some love in the chat. I know we wish we could be here in person applauding, but they did an outstanding job. And if any of you would like to add a last word, please do. But thank you all so much.
I will just add, I'm so impressed with just the intentionality that you all are bringing to this. The fact that you're asking these questions is really the important part, and starting to kind of dig. Emily, you brought up so many questions that were incredibly eye-opening to me too. And just the fact that recognizing so many of these groups still are not super inclusive spaces, and continuing to challenge that, continuing to try new things, invite new people in, just get creative. Once a group or an activity has, like 15% women in a sport, that's when that sport becomes a little bit more mainstream. And so sometimes it feels like a really big effort to shift that first 10 or 15% in an activity or a space, but there is a snowball effect that happens after that. So I encourage whatever spaces you guys are in to just keep trying things, keep asking these questions, and know that that does make a difference to a lot of people. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This was such a joy. I was really nervous at first, and thanks to the panelists and to all of the names that I recognized and didn't recognize. It was really great. And I put in the chat, but just plug, I've learned so much from Danielle at Mountain Base Camp, who actually is a Harvard alum. And I think it's really important to check out a lot of those pieces just by so many different people of all different types of backgrounds. I've learned a lot, and I definitely recommend following them.
Even though I'm a panelist, I feel like I learned so much from just sitting here for an hour talking with you all and hearing your questions. So thank you guys. And here's to like continuous learning always to try to be better and make it better for everyone else too.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. We'll send this recording out to you so you can feel free to share it with friends and family. We'll link to some resources. Again, plug to Venmo, HOC General. Let's keep trying to make the difference. I really appreciate it. And I'll close it out there. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.